Thank you, Chair. So I have, as noted, four reports to present. I'm going to change the order slightly, and I'll start with the Secretary General report on promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation at the United Nations. So as you know, during its 77th session, the General Assembly recognized the importance of strengthening international tax cooperation to make it fully inclusive and more effective. Such tax cooperation can support efforts to fight illicit financial flows, increase domestic resource mobilization, and achieve the SDGs. The General Assembly also decided by consensus to begin intergovernmental discussions at UN headquarters on ways to make international tax cooperation, again, fully inclusive and more effective, and asked the Secretary General to produce the report on promotion of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation at the United Nations. This report, I want to start by noting that it's been informed by over 80 written submissions received since March 2023, subsequent multi-stakeholder consultations, and in-house and independent academic research, and thank you all who contributed. I should note that in the input, some countries chose to provide national inputs individually, while others pooled them through international organizations, groupings, et cetera. And there's been independent researchers have actually done analysis of the inputs. So if you're interested in seeing a breakdown of the inputs and their outcomes, some of the main points, there's a link on our website. And all of the inputs were made publicly available on the UN website. The report does three things. It analyzes existing arrangements in international tax cooperation, identifies additional options to make tax cooperation fully inclusive and more effective, and outlines potential next steps. It starts by using a definition that's derived from the inputs and analysis of inclusive and effective international tax cooperation in substance and process. And for example, on process, this includes participation, agenda setting, decision-making, and implementation, including monitoring and avoidance and resolution of tax disputes. In analyzing the status quo and identifying additional options, the report does two things. It focuses on the interlinked criteria of inclusiveness and effectiveness, highlighting that these two are interlinked, and it takes a forward-looking, action-oriented perspective. The analyses against these benchmarks finds that enhancing the UN's role in setting international tax rules may be the most viable path forward to make tax cooperation fully inclusive and more effective. The report sets out three options for consideration by member states. Option one, a multilateral convention on tax, would be a regulatory in nature and set out a broad range of enforceable obligations regarding international tax cooperation. It has the potential to provide a sound structure for international tax cooperation, but it also requires strong political commitment and agreement on substance. Option two, a framework convention on international tax cooperation, would only establish common objectives and broad commitments regarding international tax cooperation, along with a general system of governance. Regulation of specific issues would be covered under protocols, and these protocols could, for example, be decided at a later date. In other words, the framework convention would secure agreement on a general level, while additional agreements for targeted measures would be agreed item by item. Option three, a framework for international tax cooperation, would provide a non-legally binding agenda for coordinated action for improving tax cooperation, akin to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It would create a platform for discussion and coordination, but would not contain binding commitments for participating countries, which could impinge on the effectiveness of this option. In outlining the next steps associated with each option, the report presents a two-step procedure that could apply for both the multilateral and framework conventions, options 1 and 2. In the first step, the General Assembly could establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc and expert advisory group to prepare draft TORs for negotiating a convention, which to be presented at its next session. And in step 2, if once the GA agrees on the TORs, it could establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc committee to negotiate the convention. For the legally non-binding framework, option 3, the General Assembly could establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc expert group with a defined time frame, and the group would serve as a preparatory committee to undertake the work, negotiating input papers and draft outcome documents, et cetera, that would precede the high-level subject matter conference from which such a framework would typically emerge. Thus, as the report notes, the speed at which the next steps can be taken for the three options may not differ significantly. Member states may, of course, consider other options or variations of combinations to make international tax cooperation fully inclusive and more effective, and the Secretariat stands rather ready to provide further explanation and technical input and support as needed. So thank you so much. I will go now to the second report on international coordination and cooperation to combat illicit financial flows. This is the second report on combating illicit financial flows. It provides an opportunity for the Secretary General to provide detail on implementation of commitments, highlight new developments, and suggest further measures. There are some key developments in this area. First, just to note that despite some progress, there are many challenges in combating illicit financial flows, and large volumes of resources continue to be lost due to corruption, tax avoidance, and tax evasion. The report is, of course, related to the discussion on strengthening the inclusiveness and effectiveness of international tax cooperation in the report I just mentioned at the United Nations, because many aspects of international tax cooperation are focused on eliminating tax-related illicit financial flows. So these two reports are linked to each other. In the last year, some other updates. UNODC published new data on the volumes of assets frozen, seized, confiscated, and returned in relation to corruption offenses. The report sheds light on the acceleration of asset return and also the major barriers to successful international asset recovery. And also, the Financial Action Task Force took a decision in February of last year to amend the beneficial ownership standards related to legal vehicles, but it did not mandate a registry approach. So this means that legal vehicles such as financial trusts are covered by different and less stringent standards than legal entities such as corporations, which can obviously lead to tax loopholes. So the main recommendations of the report are that, first, that this year's report focuses on the need for improving data, as well as improving access to data and use of data. Second, information allows authorities to better enforce the law, and information needs to be more widely available while still appropriately respecting privacy rights. Developing countries should not remain outside the information sharing mechanisms of tax. And so recommendations are that the committee may wish to consider including mechanisms such as non-reciprocal automatic tax information provision that can increase the availability of information for developing countries. In addition, better beneficial ownership information is needed on all legal vehicles. This relates to the point I made earlier on there being different standards for different types of legal vehicles, and there are benefits from sharing and publication of this information. The third point, the third recommendation, is that business regulatory practices for professions that enable illicit financial flows are not consistent across countries, which, of course, not only leads to little disincentive for actors facilitating illicit financial flows, but also can lead to incentives for actors who want to facilitate illicit financial flows and profit from that. Last year, the General Assembly invited the UN Department and offices to jointly prepare a global mapping and existing business regulatory policy, standards, and guidelines in consultation with stakeholders. But there were no dedicated resources to support the mapping. They have not yet been identified. And member states could mandate such work on this matter if there is interest in moving that forward at a quicker pace. And then the fourth point is that the Secretary General has called for more international coordination on illicit financial flows. So basically, there's an absence of political coordination across the three different facets of IFFs, international tax cooperation, anti-money laundering, and anti-corruption. And there's a question of how do we coordinate across these three different legs. In line with proposals in our common agenda for strengthening inclusive network multilateralism, the Secretary General here reiterates the suggestion for a UN-based coordination mechanism on IFFs. So that is the second report. Again, the Secretariat stands willing to help with any additional explanation, technical input, or support as needed. I will now go to the third report. This is the Secretary General report on international financial system and development. This report is the first of these three reports that has that is a report we've been doing that's been around for years. The report provides updates on new and emerging challenges for international financial system and puts forth proposals for reform in support of sustainable development. Key developments in this area, and there are a lot. The global financial system, as it's commonly agreed at this point, that it's not delivering the financial stability needed or the resources to the right places needed to achieve the SDGs. Since the report, more recently, the rapid rise in interest rates and global shocks that first increased financial market risks in developed countries, which we saw in some of the bank failures earlier this year, and as we all know, has also exacerbated debt vulnerabilities and contributed to rising debt rising debt service burdens and rising debt risks. In 2022, 25 developing countries dedicated more than a fifth of their total revenues towards servicing external public debt. So there are two issues here. One is the lack of fiscal space and the inability to invest in development and sustainable development, what we have called a great finance, in the 2022 Financing for Sustainable Development report, a great finance divide. And the second is what happens when countries go into debt distress, and do we have a good way, an easy way, and an effective and efficient way for them to restructure. The report highlights that interest rates also, the rise in interest rates also hit other markets. So for example, it hit the crypto market, and total market capitalization of crypto assets declined by 60% from its peak 2 years ago. And policymakers and international standard-setting bodies, though, have been making progress in strengthening supervision and regulatory frameworks surrounding crypto assets, but more work needs to be done. And some additional updates. On debt, despite recent progress, implementation of the G20 Common Framework has been slow. In June 2023, Zambia reached an agreement with its official creditors, but this was more than 2 years after the country first applied for debt restructuring. On multilateral development banks, the second area of where the report and the reforms to the international financial system has been highlighted, including in the SDG stimulus. MDBs are making progress on reforms that will enable them to scale up financing for the SDGs. Following the annual meetings in 2022, the World Bank developed, as you know, the evolution proposals to enhance its mission, operating model, and its financial model and capacity. There are some updates since the report came out. A summary paper for the Development Committee was published at the end of September 2023, which refers to the SDGs and the SDG stimulus. But it still doesn't explicitly include the SDGs in the World Bank's mandate. At the 2023 high-level dialogue on financing for development, President Banga of the World Bank outlined efforts by the World Bank to stretch its balance sheet further, which included hybrid capital instruments, new uses of callable capital, as well as, for the first time, noting the exploration of the use of SDRs. In September 2023, the Asian Development Bank approved capital management reforms that would unlock $100 billion in new funding capacity over the next decade. Another point on hybrid capital and rechanneling of SDRs, as I think most of you know, and this is in the report, the African Development Bank has jointly with the Inter-American Development Bank has put forward innovative proposal to allow countries to use special drawing rights as hybrid capital, which can then be levered by 3 to 5 times to provide long-term financing. And updates since the SG report here as well. The AFDB needs at least 5 countries to support the mechanism to make it functional, and there is growing support for this and for this to happen. And then by the end of July 2023, the African Development Bank also achieved an important milestone for its proposed first hybrid capital issuance, with S&P assigning a AA rating to it, which is the highest possible credit rating for this type of asset. So I'm sorry to go through all these details, but the main points are just that there is real movement in many of these areas, and yet it's probably not fast enough for countries that are suffering from and unable to invest in SDGs. The main recommendations on the report include the Secretary General has called for an SDG stimulus to provide relief for countries in need, as well as more long-term reforms to address weaknesses and close gaps in the financial architecture. This includes increasing the capacity of multilateral development banks, and the measures mentioned above are part of this, but there's also questions on the need for capital increases, and if so, what the timing of that would be. So the capital increases, the decision to take it takes a long time, and there's a fear of waiting for too long to start discussions on what capital is needed because of the timing may just take it may be extended for a longer period. So these efforts, though, however, to increase the capacity of multilateral development banks should also be accompanied by reforms that target greater sustainable development impacts. So when we think about increasing development finance, it's not just about the quantity, it's also about the quality, and we still don't have a good way of measuring impact of lending. So that's an area where a lot more work needs to be done, and measuring sustainable development impact. The global financial safety net also needs to be strengthened further. I think that the IMF actually just noted this as well, and made fit for purpose to effectively respond to new and emerging challenges. The Secretary General has been calling for commitments to rechannel an additional $100 billion of unused special drawing rights to developing countries, including through MDBs, because MDBs, as I mentioned earlier, are able to leverage this 3 to 4 times to really increase the impact. Finally, transforming governance of international financial institutions, including strengthening the voice and representation of developing countries. So again, we and the Secretariat stands ready to help in any way and support negotiations in any ways that are helpful. And finally, I will get to the final report, the Secretary General's report on follow-up to an implementation of the outcomes of the international conferences on financing for development. So as you all know very well, in the 77th session, the General Assembly decided to consider convening in 2025 a 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. The report lays out main trends and challenges that have impacted financing for development, and based on this analysis, it identifies key questions and challenges that a 4th conference could address in each of the action areas of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Key messages and developments from the report. The first is what I mentioned, actually talking about the IFS report. One of the reasons I changed the order so that these could be linked to each other is that global sustainable development prospects continue to diverge in a world characterized by multiple and concurrent crises, and there is a real risk, if left unaddressed, the ongoing finance divide will translate into a lasting sustainable development divide. Several emerging trends have contributed to this finance divide and risk further exacerbating it, and some of these are long-term trends and others are short-term trends. But in general, some of the long-term trends include that there's been a real rise in systemic risks, including climate-related risks, but not only, also health-related risks and other types of systemic risks. We know there's an under-provision of global public goods, and there's also growing risks of geopolitical fragmentation. And each of these different types of trends in different ways has put pressure on the financing ability of countries to finance themselves and leading to a greater divisions and financing gap. And I think there's general agreement now that the international financial architecture and global economic governance were not designed to address these challenges. So both domestic and international actions will be needed to make development financing fit for purpose in this environment. At the national level, the report highlights the use of country-owned sustainable industrial transformation strategies, building on last year's 2023 Financing for Sustainable Development report, as well as integrated national financing frameworks that can help countries achieve social and economic objectives and a just transition. And globally, there is broad agreement on the need to address reforms to the international financial architecture, with discussions ongoing, and discussions, as you know, are ongoing throughout the international system. This is evidenced in global initiatives such as the Bridgetown Initiative, the Paris Summit for the New Global Financial Pact, the outcome of the SDG Summit, discussions in the G20, discussions at the high-level dialogue on financing for development, and in thinking forward to the preparations for the Summit of the Future, as well as the potential, the issue of whether to have a conference. As the custodian of the SDGs and the convener of climate negotiations, the United Nations has an important role to play in ensuring that reforms to the international financial architecture support implementation of the SDGs and climate agreements and bring the globe together on many of these issues. While reform implementation can and will happen elsewhere, the United Nations brings together voices from all countries on an equal footing, along with voices of stakeholders such as business and civil society. It also brings together different, and can bring together, and has the possibility to bring together different elements of government, such as foreign affairs, finance, development cooperation, environment, et cetera. This is particularly important as we discuss the issues we're looking at, because finance and political issues are more linked than they ever have been before. And one of the things we tend to think about is that if you, some of the decisions that a short-term finance, that makes sense from a short-term perspective from a finance ministry, may have long-term political implications that have a higher cost. And these need to be brought together to better understand the implication of the changes that we're making and the choices we're making. A fourth international conference on financing for development could provide an opportunity to ensure that reforms are fit for purpose for the 21st century and aligned with the SDGs. So recommendations for action. In light of the above key messages, member states may wish to start considering not only the question of convening, but also some of the questions of how to organize the preparations for a fourth international conference. So to start considering, along with it, some of the modality questions. The issues such as a conference would be, the issues that a conference are going to address will be challenging, but also technical. And they'll be politically challenging as well as have a technical aspect. And resolving them and finding where we as an international community can land, where there's agreement, and where we can find solutions that are both ambitious and bold and politically feasible, will require sustained engagement on both technical and political levels. And that's going to depend on a preparatory process that engages experts from capitals early and in a sustained manner. So really to think about how to do that early is really important. And the committee may also wish to consider and reach consensus on the main focus of a fourth international conference, responding to the myriad of global challenges, but also new opportunities that are arising in a much changing global context. So thank you so much, and we're here to help.
Doy las gracias a la